Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is the bonus video for my newsletter subscribers for the month of October. If you are watching this during October, that means you're already subscribed to the newsletter, and so let me just say thank you. If you're watching it in November, December, and on, that means that you're not yet subscribed to the newsletter, and so you don't get the early access to exclusive content every single month. Drop on over to jaaronsimmons.com, get signed up for the newsletter so that you don't miss out on anything in the future, and also you get these extended videos as soon as they are released. Now, for all of you, whenever you're watching this, in this issue, what I do is think a lot about the way in which the strange can be found in the familiar, and the way in which the sublime is located in the pedestrian. The idea here is as we enter fall, as our flannels come out and our hats go from ball caps to toboggans, what we're doing is navigating a new season. But these new seasons, of course, it's not that everything is radically changed. It's that the same things we did before now look different. The walks in the woods, it's the same trail, but everything is changed once the leaves start turning in the colors, once the ground goes from red clay here in the Carolinas to being just covered with leaves. Our footsteps go from being fairly silent to being a cacophony of crunches and swirls and swishes. For me, this is actually something that is really profoundly philosophically important. It's the idea that the ordinary is where life happens. We tend to ignore the ordinary. David Foster Wallace famously says that the stuff that is most obvious, so hidden in plain sight, it's the stuff that we fail to talk about. Now, as I've discussed in other of my YouTube videos, this is basically Heidegger's idea. Martin Heidegger, 20th century German phenomenologist and existential philosopher. Heidegger says that we receive the history of our world as handed over in a mode of obviousness. What could that possibly mean? Well, for Heidegger, the idea is that we don't actually navigate the world as strange. We navigate it immediately as already made sense of. It's already a meaningful world and it's already interpreted. It's already been narrated in a particular way and given to us before we start the hard work of philosophical reflection about what does this stuff mean. Now, for Heidegger and Wallace, the goal in pointing out the way that the obvious gets taken for granted is to try to encourage us to think more deeply, to reflect a little bit more profoundly, to scratch on the surface, to see what lies beneath. It's sort of like, having a painting of dogs playing poker and you start scratching at the surface and realize that there's a Monet or a Cézanne just below the surface. How is it that we develop the ears to hear, the eyes to see, the awareness for noticing the sublime in the pedestrian? Well, here, it's going to be tricky, right? Because philosophy as such is basically the strategy for doing this. Philosophy as a way of life, as a mode of living, as a way of developing what Aaron James calls adaptive attunement. We adapt only if we are attuned to what the world's giving us, to what life is presenting. But only in that attunement does our adaptation navigate it in the right sorts of ways, right? We could adapt to something and entirely mess it up, but our adaptation has to be relative to the awareness we cultivate as we live. They go together. So what would philosophy look like as a kind of attention gathering, a turning of our consciousness towards things in particular ways to see more there? Well, here I actually think there are three resources that I want to just throw out to you. And again, these longer form videos allow me a little bit more informal mode of sort of talking through these ideas. So please don't hear this as some sort of, lecture from on high or something that is fully fleshed out, right? It's not a conference presentation to a bunch of PhDs. This is us talking together. I'm literally sitting by a outdoor fire pit. Tonight it will have a campfire in it. My son's birthday was just a couple days ago. We're having some of his friends over tonight. We're going to be making s'mores by the fire pit. thinking together. He wants to play music out here by the fire pit. He's been working on his guitar so he can play fire pit songs, as he says. And this ordinary, mundane activity is also where the magic of relational existence transpires. And that idea is something I think that philosophy can help us live into a little bit more effectively. So I'm going to give you 3 suggestions, again, informally. If you have questions about this, drop comments in. Let's think together. So the first idea is we can draw on phenomenology as a way of cultivating this adaptive attunement, this awareness, this attention turning toward the obvious to realize it's not quite so clear as we thought. Phenomenology effectively says that we interrogate the way the world gives itself to our consciousness by thinking through how our consciousness of the world functions. In other words, it's taking very seriously the experience of living as experienced. Now, this is important, right? Because when we think about doing this phenomenological work, most phenomenologists don't start with radically extreme examples of the way that we navigate the world. They talk about things like a coffee cup in front of us sitting on the table. They'll talk about the tree in the distance. They'll talk about hearing someone call your name and you turning toward them. Phenomenology happens at the most mundane level of experience because it turns out that that's where the structure of experience is most pronounced. It reveals itself to us if we just pay attention. Now, phenomenology developed by Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, Emmanuel Levinas, Jacques Derrida, all these different thinkers. I care less for the kind of work that you and I are doing together that we can recite the finer points of their philosophical programs. Now, I think that's awesome, right? And I do that in my professional life. But I'm more interested when we think together here in not so much how is it that what we're doing is Heideggerian, and more how is it that what we're doing is purposive. It's intended this way. And this is where phenomenology actually really speaks. It sings. Because the whole point of this phenomenological process is to get us to be aware of the structures by which our experience is actually made present to us. And one of the primary modes is what Husserl calls intentional consciousness. In other words, our consciousness is never just sort of an abstract thing sitting out there somewhere. Right? There is no brain in a vat that's sort of navigating all of these inputs and then turning it into something like the sensory world. We are already invested, already engaged. Our consciousness is, says Husserl, consciousness of something. Consciousness is already relational, and objects are already intended by my consciousness. That can sound super abstract. But again, think of it at the most practical level. When my son and his friends are sitting around this fire pit tonight, it's not one of those moments where I've got to do complicated philosophical work. I instead can take very seriously the fact that when I look at them, I'm not just seeing a question about solipsistic consciousness. What I'm doing is actually becoming fully invested in the practice by which their identity is being formed. And that's pretty cool. So phenomenology is not just a methodological abstraction. It is a method of doing philosophy such that we are propelled back into the very living of our lives. The second resource, I think, for finding the sublime and the pedestrian, for being invested in the obvious so that we realize it's not so clear, and for scratching the surface off of the familiar to see the strangeness and the excess that lies just below, is, I actually think, poetry. Poetry is pretty slick, right? Because it can do something that philosophers are really bad at. Poetry can say profound things quickly. Philosophers tend to use 10 times more words than necessary to say something that could have been said really briefly, really quickly. Now, this is actually important, though, because when philosophers do this sort of work, what it is that we're doing is trying to think through the nuance, unpack the objections, respond to critique. And all of those are important layers that attend thinking well as a praxis, as a mode of existing. But when it comes to living, sometimes thinking well happens when we allow ourselves to just be in the presence of what speaks to us. And so I want to give you a couple examples of how I see this playing out in really, really profound ways, such that it, again, does this work of turning our attention, our intentional consciousness, oriented toward the everyday. And there seeing the grand, seeing maybe even the holy. So the first place I want to refer is actually a poem by Walt Whitman called A Song of Joys. Now, what's so cool about this, it's a very long poem actually, but in the poem what he does is talks about all of the different types of joy that play out for different kinds of embodied living. Listen to just a few examples. The agonistic throes, the ecstasies, joys of the solemn musings day or night, joy of the thought of death, the great spheres, time and space, prophetic joys of better, loftier love's ideals, the divine wife, the sweet, eternal, perfect comrade, joys all thine own undying one, joys worthy thee, O soul. O while I live to be the ruler of life and not a slave. And he goes on, right? It's that passage there, which is so inspiring. You may remember that last line from Dead Poets Society even, but listen to some of this stuff. Oh, to bathe in swimming baths, to splash the water, to walk ankle deep, or race naked along the shore. Oh, knowest thou the excellent joys of youth, joys of the clear companions and the merry word and laughing face. Tonight when my son is sitting here with his friends, I will literally watch the joys of youth, even though I'm no longer as young as I once was. Oh, the orator's joys, to inflate the chest, to roll the thunder of the voice out from the ribs and throat. I mean, my goodness, right? He's talking about all the different possible joys in the most mundane happenings of embodied living. And then he gets to this passage, which again is a Dead Poets Society favorite. But wow, it gets me every time. Oh, to struggle against great odds, to meet enemies undaunted, to be entirely alone with them, to find out how much one can stand, to look strife, torture, prison, popular odium face to face, to mount the scaffold, to advance to the muzzles of guns with perfect nonchalance, to be indeed a god. Now, what is it Whitman's doing when he makes that last line there is not some sort of theistic account, right? That we must, replace the divine or abandon our religious commitments and position ourselves in some sort of, radical transcendental humanism. What Whitman's doing is instead reminding us that we are meaning-making beings. We are the kinds of beings who do not only inherit the world as obvious, but we are responsible for creating the world handed over to others as obvious. What world will we create? What world will we will to be true? Whitman invites us into that because it turns out this is not some grand scheme that occurs behind the scenes. It's something we do with every single decision. Life, says Kierkegaard, is the moment of decision, and with every decision we make, we are shaping the world. We're not just receiving it, we are creating it, we are passing it on. And that is something that I hope encourages you the way it does me. Whatever your religious commitments, however you stand in relationship to the notion of God, this idea that we are world-making beings is something that I find to be really strange, internal to the very familiar decision that we make at every instant about how to go forward in our lives. Let me give you another example of some poetry that does this sort of work. This is from one of my favorite poets, a guy named Atticus, or at least writes under the pseudonym Atticus. And this is, of course, my son's name's Atticus. That relationship is something that I find, compelling. So here's a couple of his poems. So many of us are starving for life and have no idea until the end when we look back and see the uneaten banquet. Wow. Notice The metaphor is anchored in our embodied need. The fact that we eat is something that he uses as the impetus to the profound awareness that finitude is real and our decisions make a difference. He continues this kind of embodied metaphor and does so in another poem that always just rocks my world. Listen to this. Find something that makes you forget to eat and sleep and drink, and then do it until you die of thirst. Right? In one little stanza of poetry, he's able to do what it takes existentialists volumes to work out. Find something that is absolutely so exciting that it makes you forget all of the normal, regular, ordinary things, and then do it until your body cries out. I find that to be not just encouraging, but a kind of inspirational, hospitable way of inviting a life well lived. So, one, phenomenology helps us make sense of the way that we intend the world, that we are already engaged and invested in it. Two, poetry, Whitman, Atticus, whoever, invites us to think deeply about the way in which saying something quickly can attend to the depth that sometimes gets lost when we spend too much time exploring the philosophical nuance. So read poems. It makes the world better. And then third, my suggestion here is actually probably not surprising to any of you who have read Camping with Kierkegaard, but my suggestion is find ways to get outdoors in nature. This, again, is not something that should be perplexing. This is part of how I make sense of the world. It's how I find joy. I'd rather be in the mountains than almost anywhere else. I'd rather be on a river with my dad or my son than almost anywhere else. And yet, Nietzsche understood that it's by walking that we find ourselves most profoundly. It's an awareness that runs throughout philosophers. Kierkegaard says somewhere actually in a journal that he couldn't write in the city, so he had to take a journey. He had to go somewhere else. Now you might think, well, we go to the mountains to change up the perspective, to go into the unfamiliar, the wild. And that makes sense, right? There's a different video we could talk about that would think deeply about how wildness is actually part of the philosophical task. I did a philosophy video just a few weeks ago for the YouTube channel called Philosophy in the Wild. But today I want to flip that and think about the opposite notion. When we go to the mountains, when we go to the beach, when we hike the deserts, again, it's not about the place. It's about when we are outside of the social trappings that define the normal for us. We invite ourselves to think about what matters differently. Whitman says elsewhere that he loafs and invites his soul. It's hard to invite our souls when our souls are being told over and over and over to do more, be more, push harder, get stuff done, meet that deadline. And those are not bad things as such, but they are soul crushing if we allow them to be, in fact, our God, rather than reminding ourselves that we have to figure out what world should be made real. Go outside. Look for leaves that are amazing to you. Find something ordinary, like a stick, and figure out what extraordinary thing it can make possible. I mean, my goodness, when I was a kid, I used to hang out with my grandpa, and he'd pull out his pocket knife, and just any stick became an occasion for wonder as we would whittle it away together and talk. Finding ways to explore actually allows us not to become complacent relative to the everyday. So those are my suggestions this month. I know this is less kind of, working through one specific philosophical idea like I've done in the past, accounting for some particular ism, but it's where my head is today as I prepare for my son's fire pit birthday party, as I eagerly anticipate the cooler weather that's starting to come now as the fall begins. I'm thinking a lot about how finding the strange and the familiar, the sublime and the pedestrian, is actually what makes every day more compelling instead of living our lives just towards those big sporadic moments where something grand occurs. We should find ways to see the glorious in the mundane. And I think phenomenology, poetry, and spending time outdoors invites us to do all three things a little bit better. Well, I hope this is helpful. I hope it's inspiring to you to do some of these things. Please let me know. Drop a comment here in YouTube. Send me an email. My email is simmonsphilosopher@gmail.com. Again, if you aren't subscribed, go get subscribed to the newsletter. There's content every single month. And those of you who already are, thank you so much for thinking with me, for walking with me. I really, really, really appreciate it. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.